All right, we'll go ahead and kick off as folks continue to trickle in. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you may be in the world. My name is Sophia Arend, and I'm the Global Blockchain Business Council's Communications and Content Lead. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the Global Blockchain Business Council, GBBC, and Global Digital Finance's, GDF's, Global Leaders Series. Today, we are joined by Robert Opp, Chief Digital Officer at the United Nations Development Program, and our host today is GBBC CEO and GDF Board Director Sandra Ro. Together, they will host a conversation on what it means to lead digital transformation at the UNDP and how Robert's team is harnessing new technologies such as blockchain to improve the lives of those furthest behind. Just briefly before we begin, I'd like to introduce our guest. As I mentioned, Robert is currently the Chief Digital Officer of the United Nations Development Program. This is the United Nations Global Sustainable Development Organization working across 170 countries globally with more than 17,000 staff. He leads the agency's digital transformation, an organization-wide effort to harness the power of new technology to improve the lives of those furthest behind. Prior to this role, Robert served as director of the Innovation and Change Management Division within the United Nations World Food Program, where he established an in-house zero hunger innovation accelerator and created an award-winning crowdfunding smartphone app called Share the Meal, which has raised over $40 million for hunger programs. Thank you so much, Robert, for joining us, and to everyone joining us live. If you have questions for Robert at any point during today's conversation, please enter them in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen, and Sandra will take them throughout. Thank you. I'll hand things over to you, Sandra.
Fantastic. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you especially to Robert for making the time out of your busy schedule to join us today. We're so delighted to have you. And Sophia mentioned the Share a Meal app that you developed, and I will have to tell you, as a user and donor, it is one of the best apps out there. You should all check it out, and you can also do a good thing by donating funds for meals for folks around the world through the World Food Program. So Robert, welcome. And this is a chance and opportunity for the audience to get to know not only the UNDP and the work that you do, but also you yourself and your career path. So could we start off by you discussing your journey to how you ended up as Chief Digital Officer at the UNDP?
Sure. And Sandra, it's nice to be here. It's always nice to be with you in the Global Blockchain Business Council. It's a good question. I'm Canadian by nationality. I was born and raised in the province of Alberta, which is in the western part of Canada. I actually grew up on a grain farm, and so really not a lot of international issues as such. But when I went to university, I studied history, and then I studied international affairs, and that kind of took me in a totally different direction. And my professional career really started when I was posted to Angola, which is in southwestern Africa, in the middle of a civil war. And I was working with the World Food Program and doing some, emergency response and things like that. And from there, my UN career started.
Wow.
But I also took a little bit of a break from that and did some management consulting for a while. So I was with the Boston Consulting Group for some time, based in Singapore, and that actually really got me interested in how actually change is being driven inside organizations and how organizations have impact on the world. So that's when I really started to do these roles that were more focused on innovation, digital technology, and so on. And that is actually what led me up to the current position of Chief Digital Officer at UNDP.
Amazing. And for those out there, there's trivia question. Robert is Canadian, for those who didn't know. And you started your career in Angola in the middle of a civil war. That's pretty amazing. And for those who may not be as familiar, because the United Nations is quite a complex organization. Could you explain UNDP itself and how it fits in the larger United Nations organization?
Yeah, this is a tricky one to do in a couple of minutes, but
okay.
the UN system is comprised of a UN secretariat at the center. That's where the Security Council is and the General Assembly is. But then there's a very large family of agencies that are in the system itself. UNDP is the development arm, the International Sustainable Development arm of the UN. And we have a mandate, broadly speaking, of poverty eradication, and that gets us into lots of other kinds of programs as well. But UNDP is one of the agencies with the largest footprint. So we have people on the ground in 170 countries and territories globally, with 17 to 18,000 staff members. It's one of the operational agencies as opposed to the normative agencies. So there are other agencies in the UN system that, like the World Health Organization and the International Telecommunications Union, they set standards, they provide, normative guidance on things. UNDP is more on the operational end of the spectrum. And so we have a lot of direct operations supporting our partners worldwide, which are governments, communities around the world.
Amazing. And your role, you are the first person to step into this role as Chief Digital Officer. Could you talk a little bit about how it came about? What was this decision, or why was decision made that you needed to have a Chief Digital Officer inside of the UNDP?
Yeah, so that's really driven by the leadership of UNDP. Our administrator, who's like our CEO, Achim Steiner, he was really, when he joined the organization in 2017, he was really seized with a lot of the kinds of the areas where UNDP needs to be relevant and needs to stay current. And so he launched a lot of innovation type initiatives in the organization and things. But one of them that he turned his attention to in early 2019 was, how is the organization systematically addressing the issue of digital? Because in UNDP, there had been a lot of digital work done in different countries around the world. As you can imagine, working in 170 countries, there are lots of different initiatives going on. And so there were some really strong examples of country-based digital innovation, but it was not being done from a systemic or a coherent point of view.
Right.
So Achim decided that we really need a digital strategy to lift the organization, to ensure that it's relevant for the future in the space of digital. And so one of the ideas, they did a strategy, and then one of the first parts of the strategy is to actually bring a chief digital officer on board. I apologize if you can hear sirens in the background. I'm in Manhattan, so it sort of comes with the territory.
Absolutely. It's part of our, existence in New York City. So I hear you. I was wondering if it was actually me, but then I realized it was you.
Yeah.
So yes, connecting the dots across 170 countries, that has got to be a need there. We see it even in our network, and we're in 76 jurisdictions. And that's a very important role, is to connect the dots and actually bring lots of different groups together, and also the commonalities, and then figure out where the gaps are. So let's talk about digital with respect to eradicating poverty. I think one of the big concerns, and we talk about this a lot at the GBBC, is it's wonderful that we're seeing the digital economy grow, and we're seeing it grow in lots of different places. But there's also an entire subset of people who could be really harmed and left behind if we don't make sure that they're included in the digital world and growth that's happening right now. What are your thoughts on that, and how UNDP is looking to support bringing as many people along as possible?
Yeah, so this is a huge and urgent issue, particularly in the light of the COVID pandemic. So there are about 3.7 billion people who are still not connected to the internet. That's about 45% of the world's population. So, we talk a lot about, digital racing forward and things, but, there's still almost half of humanity is not actually regularly connected to the internet. And this became really apparent and urgent in the COVID pandemic, because governments around the world really tried to include people, or rather, because of social distancing and other measures, they needed to go digital, and so they went online for a lot of services. But people who were not connected were left out of those, and so this is a huge issue. And when you look at that digital divide, that 3.7 billion people not connected, the issue is actually not just physical infrastructure or mobile broadband, because most of the population of the world actually lives in coverage areas, but they're not connected because they either can't afford it or they don't have the skill set to use. Now, there's
Yeah.
still 700 million people who aren't even living in coverage areas, but still, it's a smaller amount than the 3.7 that
Right.
are in the digital divide. So the real challenge there is how do we try to connect these people, and then once they're connected, how do we ensure that they have safe and meaningful connection, and that they are served by platforms and services and others that are actually going to make their lives better. So that comes in all sorts of different kind of ways and scenarios, but
Right.
we're really looking at how can we make sure that with better income generation, with livelihood support, people are able to afford internet. Also looking at different business models for airtime and things like that. There's also the on the kind of safe and meaningful connection type side of things. It's making sure that countries are aware of the kind of regulatory frameworks that they need to put in place, the data privacy measures, countering misinformation, and so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
the inclusion, this digital inclusion issue is really a very wide one that goes all the way from kind of getting people devices that are connected to putting the enabling environment in place that can really support that safe and meaningful and beneficial access.
And as you said, there are myriad of complex issues around all of that. And it's not just developing nations that people think about. They automatically go to developing nations, say, oh, yes, they might have a digital divide issue. But actually, we've seen it in the US and many European countries as well. Older people, rural areas,
Yep.
as well as some of the urban inner cities where people just don't or can't afford. It's more of an affordability issue as
Yes.
opposed to a access issue.
Yeah, and then actually when you actually start to put digital platforms in place as well, you have to think not just about the connectivity, but also people with disabilities or other kind of language challenges and things like that. So we
Right.
did see good and less good examples coming out of country responses from COVID. So
Right.
we saw, for example, I think it was Egypt, if I'm not mistaken, developed a mobile app for hearing impaired people. And so you can see there are different ways to leverage technology also to make it really inclusive of those who aren't connected, but also those who have disabilities or other kind of marginalized populations.
Absolutely. And mindfulness around all of these, when we talk about digital inclusion, really appreciate you bringing that up, because I think sometimes we don't really widen the scope of what inclusion really, really means. And we need to be careful about that. It's language. It's about having different abilities and including various folks in any of those categories. Would love it if the audience felt any questions, feel free to ask them as we go along. I have a bunch of questions that I'm going to pepper Robert with, but obviously this is for the audience to also take the opportunity to ask Robert questions. But as we're moving along, I really would love it if you could spend a little bit of time on the 6 signature solutions. It's a lot of S's. I just want to be careful
Yes.
there. 6 signature solutions, and what is that, first of all, and then ensuring digital technologies and considerations are prioritized. That's great.
Right. So UNDP, I mentioned before, UNDP is the development arm of the UN system. Poverty eradication is one of these 6 signature solutions. What those refer to is basically our kind of strategic direction for the organization. So currently, poverty is one of them. Also, governance. So all about sort of the strengthening institutions at the country level and sometimes city level and others, communities. Resilience, and that's kind of resilience and recovery from crisis. So a lot of, when you think about it, when a crisis erupts in the world, whether natural disaster or conflict, it's about how do we build back better, how do we build resilience, and those kinds of things.
Yes.
Environment issues, so conservation, physical environment, climate change, energy, including renewables, and gender. So those are the 6 signature solutions. And what we do as a digital team within UNDP is all of those signature solutions have their own kind of outcomes or targets that they're trying to reach. And so we look at how can we work to use technology that will support and enable the different areas of work, so the different thematic teams and things that are working on. So for example, with the climate change team, we do a lot of work on supporting on the data side of things. With governance, it's about providing e-government services, sometimes policy and regulatory advice and things like that for new technologies. Poverty eradication can be about e-commerce platforms, and we saw a lot of those in the wake of COVID. So across every part of our business, we see the potential for technology to support what we're doing. And of course, we have to be aware of the other issues, some of which we mentioned around digital inclusion and the getting the policies right and so on as well.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And we have a question here from Rakesh, and I'm going to bring it in because it actually ties into my next question. We were very fortunate to have you be a keynote speaker at our UN General Assembly Blockchain Central event about a month ago. And you talked about a lot of very important topics, but of course you grounded some of the examples in blockchain technology. And the question from Rakesh here is related around, do you envisage that blockchain has a role in addressing the digital divide? Can blockchain be utilized to help support digital inclusion and access, as we discussed?
Yeah, fantastic question. So we do see, so a lot of these things converge and they're quite related. So we do see blockchain being an important new technology, just also in addition to AI and some of the other new technologies, but blockchain is particularly good at a few things. So well, probably more than a few, but a couple of the examples of that. So we, the UN, UNDP, and a partner of ours, the UN Capital Development Fund, have been working with the nonprofit Kiva to support the government of Sierra Leone in developing a national digital identity system. And the national digital ID is actually underpinned with blockchain. The advantage of that is that it has really allowed a combination of not only just sort of the kind of access to government services through your digital identity, but it's also connected to the financial system. So you can essentially do the KYC requirements through this system in seconds, whereas it might have taken 2 weeks before. What that means is that people who have been living in the informal economy, traders and things like that, that may not have had access before to financial services, because they now have a digital identity and a kind of a record, they can actually make the case for opening bank accounts, getting loans, and those kinds of things. So that having that system underpinned with blockchain is a very important step forward. The kind of one of the other areas that we see a lot is the track and trace type application of blockchain technologies. And what the basic premise there is that if we can improve the transparency and the kind of the validity of sustainably produced products from source or from origin all the way to consumer, we can actually charge higher prices or command higher prices for goods. So I mean, I think we see this in lots of different places. If I know that I'm going to buy a sweater that's made with Mongolian wool that has been produced sustainably, and this is actually one of the examples that we've been working on in Mongolia, then I might be willing to pay a higher price, which then in turn gives sort of more return back to the producers who are living usually in poverty. So we've done this with cacao production in Ecuador for chocolate bars. We're working on this for argan oil for cosmetics in Morocco. I mentioned the wool, cashmere wool in Mongolia, spices in India. So there's lots of different applications of this, and blockchain is an ideal technology for that because it gives you that full transparency. You can have multiple players being involved. It's a really interesting platform. So those are definitely two of the areas where they contribute to digital inclusion as well.
Absolutely. And I love your examples of giving people identity so that they can access financial services, giving people farmers, some of the worst hit folks in terms of getting fair value for what they're actually producing, a fair shake because we're able to command, or you're able to command better pricing through the platform. I think that's a wonderful, not only a set of objectives, but then results to actual people on the ground. So that's fantastic. You also mentioned in your keynote during our UNGA Blockchain Central that you are also looking at the possibility of DLT or some blockchain platform to improve bilateral carbon trading. Could you talk a little bit about your thoughts around that and how it involves the Paris Agreement, and obviously then leading into COP26? You could talk about that as well.
Sure. Yeah, so this is an interesting area of the Paris Agreement on climate change that was signed several years ago, that sets targets for countries to reduce carbon emissions. And I don't want to get too kind of arcane or bureaucratic, but within the Paris Agreement, there's something called Article 6, and Article 6 is talking about carbon trading and offsetting and things. And to be specific, Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement sets out that countries can trade carbon offsetting activities among each other bilaterally to reach their national targets. So for example, if I'm a European country and I am producing more carbon emissions than I'm offsetting, I could actually trade with another country in the world that is got carbon offsetting activities. Like let's say, for example, in Central America or West Africa, I've used the example of, let's say, planting trees in the Sahel region of West Africa, right? That's going to offset carbon. So as the European country, I could make a deal with the West African country to say, I'm going to kind of purchase my offsets through a carbon emission or a carbon reduction activity. So that, for us, that's kind of a little bit of a win-win, because it kind of gives both the opportunity for European country to reach its targets, but also the West African country to reach to get financing for a climate change mitigation activity. The problem is that because of the bilateral nature of the arrangements, it's really slowed down by a lack of standard and verifiable processes for things like authorization, issuance, and transfer, these kinds of things. So it's very fragmented. So what we've been looking at, and this is it's still in the planning stage, so exploration. Could a platform like blockchain, a distributed ledger technology, could that offer a sort of a way of bringing together these multiple parties, some that are interested in purchasing carbon offsets, some that are interested in offering activities for carbon offset, to kind of come together in that marketplace and offer a more simple, transparent, and standard approach. There actually is another part of the Paris Agreement that covers carbon trading overall. So that's not exactly what we're talking about here. This is more matching from a bilateral perspective two countries that could do things beneficially together. And having a DLT-based platform for that could be really advantageous.
Absolutely. And when I think about what that could look like, Robert, also the data that we could actually gather related to different countries working together to offset their carbon, whether they're producing too much or whether they're actually trying to mitigate. But that could then also lend to better data around what's going around in the world, and then also help policymakers make better decisions around what we actually need to do. Would you agree with that if we were to see it at that sort of mass scale visibility with a DLT platform?
Absolutely. I mean, transparency is critical to all of this, to making it all work, and people being really clear that this is how would I say, the verification of these things is absolutely critical. So
Right.
obviously that's not all going to be blockchain powered, because there's going to be human elements for inputting and things. But at the end of the day, what we need to work for is standard approaches to the kind of authorization, verification, issuance of these different kind of trades, and that I think is it's ideal for something like a DLT.
Absolutely. And you've got a bunch of questions here, but if the audience will bear with me, I will get to your questions. I would love it if you could talk a little bit about COP26. What is it for those who are not as familiar with the conference, and when are the dates? It's coming up soon.
Yes. So COP26, this is sort of the kind of the annual sessions that are held where countries come together and they review progress and potentially set new targets of carbon reduction and things. So kind of climate change mitigation annual meetings, right? And so the COP26 is the next one that's coming up. In fact, it starts at the end of the month and goes until almost mid-November. So, and it's being held in Glasgow, Scotland this year. It's really where the world comes together to say, are we making enough progress on climate change? Are we going to meet the targets that were set as part of the Paris Agreement? And what do we need to do next? So obviously there's going to be a lot of different conversations and processes and things. From our point of view, one of the bigger things that we're approaching COP with this year is looking at how to extend energy access, renewable energy access, to people who are not living in areas covered by electricity grids. And the expansion of renewable energy is critical to all of this picture of climate change and the future. So UNDP has actually created what we're calling an energy hub that has set out to provide and accelerate access to energy for about 500 million people. So 500 million people. There's about 800 or 900 million people right now living without electricity. So we're trying to with this effort, we're trying to tackle about half of those. But technology is a really important piece of this. So, for example, we actually we need better data in order to make all of this work. So one of the issues is if we're going to extend electricity to the people who don't have it, where are they exactly, and where might we situate things like solar energy installations? Sometimes we call them mini grids because they're like wind or solar installations that can provide electricity for surrounding areas, but they're not necessarily tied to the national grid. So where are these places? Where could they be? How can we make that information available to investors? How do we really understand how to target? Then how do we understand people's poverty level, their ability to pay for electricity on a sustainable basis, and other kinds of issues like that. Technology then can also help unlock some of the different business models that need to happen. So, for example, using like powering some of these off-grid mini-grid installations like solar, to be able to kind of really understand real-time energy production, weather data and how it might affect the production, really trying to think through what are all the associated business models. And the other thing we've seen is an application of, speaking of blockchain, an application of blockchain where blockchain can really give a platform for funding or crowd financing of some of these installations. So for example, we've seen, and we've actually tested this in a couple of our country offices, if you can make available the investment opportunities. So you're going to put in a solar, like even a small solar installation, and you know that there's a payback period over a certain amount of time, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. And if you open that up to individuals and say, well, if you give us $100 now, we'll pay it back, but it'll take 10 years, but you'll get your money back, or you'll get 110 back in 10 years or 5 years or whatever. Right. Lots of people would be willing to kind of put their investment forward for that, not necessarily because of the return, but because it's something that they know is investing in the right direction for the planet. So if you think about the complexity of something like that, a DLT technology or a distributed ledger technology is perfect for tracking and transparently tracing both the input of capital as well as the production of energy, almost like micro billing or micro tracking. And so we've seen a couple of examples already that are springing up in that regard. And these are really important projects to continue. So those are just a couple of ideas. And maybe, sorry to go on a little bit, Sandra, the last thing maybe to mention is that
Yeah, of course.
as UNDP, we also look for the opportunity to ensure that countries around the world have the right enabling environment to use these new technologies. And I kind of mentioned this before, but it's sort of looking at how is the national digital ecosystem equipped to support the use of blockchain or
Yes.
whatever other new technology. And in this case, those that are supporting climate change mitigation as well.
Absolutely. And as always, if there's anything that our community can do to help support, we look forward to doing that. And believe it or not, one of the questions I was about to ask you, Juan has actually asked in a slightly different way, but it's the same tone, which is how can blockchain startups participate, help UNDP in these great initiatives or ideas? How do startups get involved with an organization like the UNDP? Do you have any pointers for folks?
Yes. So there are a number of different ways, I would say. Locally, one of the things UNDP has in our country offices is that not in every single office, but most of them, that we have an actual local team that we call an accelerator lab based within our country offices. And I think we have about 92 of them that cover 116 countries, something like that. And so one of their roles is that they look at the local ecosystem and seeing how different participants of the local ecosystem can actually be brought together and focus on different development challenges. So if you're in the developing world somewhere, there's a good chance that your local UNDP country office will have an ability to sort of tap into that. More on a global scale, one of the things we're doing is we run a digital accelerator program that looks for good practices around the world to support them. And we sometimes look for startup partners who would be able to provide certain expertise or be able to kind of partner in a different country that we're looking at moving to, and those kinds of things. For those kinds of interests, my recommendation would be that you write an email and send it to digital@undp.org. And so that's just an email address that we can take in different kinds of requests and channel them in different countries and things like that as people are interested. So there are ways. It's not, the UN is still, to be really brutally honest, the UN is still figuring out how to partner most effectively with startups in the innovation ecosystem, but we're getting more experience at it and we're getting better at it.
Wonderful. And I don't know if it's related, but I'm not sure, Robert, if this is in your wheelhouse, but Parv has asked a question. First of all, thanks very much, Robert, for the insightful talk. I'd like to get involved with the World Food Program's Project Impact, EMPAC. Micro work jobs training program. I've been incubating an app, and rather than reinventing the wheel, I'd like to work with the World Food Program. What's the best way for him to get in touch with the
Sure. Well, so Impact is a really interesting project, and that's one that we started while I was still at the World Food Program. So Impact is really referring to how to it was originally started actually looking at refugees, Syrian refugees who were living in Lebanon, Jordan, and other places, and how to actually get them involved in digital work. And so it's really interesting to take refugees who essentially, most of whom had never turned on a computer before, and taking them into a curriculum so that they're able to actually do remote digital work for different companies. And that work is expanding and scaling in Iraq and other places. So my advice for getting in touch with them is either look on the World Food Program website. If you look at World Food Program Innovation, there should be a contact there for the accelerator. If that doesn't work, you can send an email to the digital@undp.org, and I'll make sure that the connection is made there somehow. Because it sounds like the person who asked that question had a particular, like an app or a startup kind of idea in mind.
Great. Well, thanks, Par, for that question, and hopefully that answered, gave you a few pointers in the right direction. Wonderful. Claude has a question for you, slightly different. It's, do you see a role for the UN and blockchain technology in verifying international removal of dangerous methane hydrate? Clearly, this person knows a lot about what's going on that's escaping in the Arctic Sea, a potent greenhouse gas. So is there any work right now being done around this? Do you have any thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, I mean, Claude clearly knows more than you and I, Sandra.
Yeah, I was going to say, good one, Claude.
I'm not an expert in methane hydrate, but what I would say is that, if you just like from a principle point of view, because I can't actually speak to that specific chemical compound and greenhouse gas, but from a blockchain point of view, if you can measure it and verify it, you can track it on a distributed ledger and make that transparently available and able to be traced back to source and all of that. That is the key to a lot of this. So whether you're talking carbon or methane or whatever, it's I think for me, I definitely see the potential for blockchain to underpin any kind of platform that needs transparency, that has multiple actors participating, that you need the auditability and the tracing already all back to source. All of that kind of thing sets it up very nicely. So I would say, I don't know about how you actually measure that kind of gas, but if it can be measured, then it can be actually put on a blockchain.
Aptly said, Robert. I think there's just this lack of, quality data around the world that really, I think, stymies and also causes friction on how big is this problem, what needs to actually happen to mitigate it, and do we all agree on the numbers that are being put out or the reports that are being put out? And if we could actually get to a place where we were working on the same platform, data set, would get further along.
That's why blockchain, if you can match it with some of the other powerful technologies, exactly what you're saying. If we can create the data systems, the standards that we need, and that can be verified as the input into the ledger, then from there on, blockchain is really ideal for making that all visible and traceable.
Yeah. And for those who are interested in whether there are frameworks or these sort of standards evolving, there's a subgroup within the GBBC that's working on the voluntary carbon credits component being tokenized. And so there's actually code that's been written on a technical standpoint, but then there's also business processes that have been actually laid out in a token taxonomy framework. So please check it out. It's on our website. It's called the Interwork Alliance. And that effort is really around how do we get to some common language, common ways of putting something together in order to arrive at hopefully a platform that people can trade. There is another question for you before we wrap up. We only have actually a few minutes left. We've gone through our time together very quickly. Really appreciate it. Let's turn to financial services and blockchain. There's a question here from Minnie asking about whether financial services are really doing a good job with sustainability using blockchain. Do we think that sustainability is something that's a driver in financial services and innovation right now? I will take this one as a former banker. I think actually a lot more needs to be done. And frankly, we're not really at a place where that is a requirement that's joined up just as important as profits. And I think we need to make that part of the mission across. And I think a lot of fintechs are starting to move in that direction. But again, I think it's something that we need to keep pushing forward. Robert, do you have any thoughts on whether financial services are focusing on sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, my comment would be maybe not specific to financial services, but more generally what we see. I mean, I would agree with you that I think financial services it could definitely do more. What we see is that blockchain is being applied in some other industries. Like I know that I think it's Daimler has kind of put their entire value chain on blockchain to sort of the understanding the kind of from a production of vehicles point of view, from start to finish, what's involved. And I know that Amazon and others are looking at the same issues around carbon emissions coming out of supply chain. So I think manufacturing industries are kind of coming to this a little bit sooner, but some other industries like financial services can do more. And you know, since we're on the topic of sustainability overall, that's actually one of the challenges we see with blockchain overall, because you know, when we talk about using blockchain for you know, our carbon emission tracking and things like that, of course, people are fast to mention that, well, what about the, you know, energy consumption of, you know, the cryptographic elements of public blockchains and things like that. And that's correct to point out. I mean, we, in technology industry as a whole, we do need to be mindful of the need for greater efficiency, the need to make sure that we find new ways to ensure that we're not, you know, using massive amounts of or consuming massive amounts of energy to power these systems. And that's the case for, you know, blockchain, particularly Bitcoin and some of the others, but also technology industry like data centers generally and things like that. We are starting to see, even in the tech industry, some commitments coming forward, like Microsoft and a few others have actually committed to carbon neutral or carbon removal targets. And that's really positive. And I think we should be, you know, we're using blockchain to be transparent about all these things like carbon. Well, let's be transparent also about how much blockchain is consuming energy, and let's work toward that. And I know there's a number of very bright people that are seized with that right now as well.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to round this out by, oh no, more questions are coming in. I feel like I can't keep up right now. There's another one from Supriya asking, you know, you gave a couple examples of what UNDP is doing using blockchain. Are there other business processes other than the digital identity, financial inclusion, banking example that you gave? Are there business processes within the UN that is using blockchain as well? Maybe your own efficiencies, I don't know.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. If the question's on internal application, we've actually been thinking about that from a point of view of even putting basic okay, so let me frame the question properly so you understand. But the UN system, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the UN system has many different organizations, players, etc. But there is mobility between them. So as a UN staff member, you can actually move from agency to agency, but you often actually have to recreate your human resource records and a few other things. And so what we've been thinking about is, how could blockchain be used for kind of pushing the envelope in this space? So not only just carrying your information, but also turning a UN employee into a like the self-sovereign data aspect of it, to say, you know, how do we put the staff member in the driver's seat to kind of say, for any agency that's interested, I'll put this information, but my medical information, I want to stay here and protected and so on and so forth. You know, so we've actually been thinking about that. That's a kind of an exploration that we're doing. We've also been looking at it as to whether there would be a kind of system internally in UNDP. We constantly share a lot of expertise across the organization, not unlike a consulting company. And so one of the ideas, and again, very high level exploration at this point, is how might we make a system with like smart contracts and things in place, you know, kind of rules put into the system for the exchange of time, you know, hours of expertise traded between projects. And so, you know, again, these are interesting ideas. We're not there yet in terms of application, but it's a very interesting space that we want to sort of say, hey, if we can do this with communities around the world, we should be able to do this ourselves.
Absolutely, and really appreciate you rounding us out. with that last comment, especially about not only the outward, but the inward efficiencies using blockchain as well. Stan, I just want to, I know Stan, so I'm going to say it. Stan, appreciate the question. You'll have to talk to Robert offline on your question, but he agrees with you, by the way, Robert, that if you can measure it, or if we can measure it, we can manage it, it can be done on blockchain. The question is, how do we make sure that we integrate all of this to the outcomes that we want? And so appreciate Stan doing that. And again, Robert, we're over time now, so thank you very much. It was great pleasure to have you. There are a lot of folks here who clearly are engaged and advocating for what you're doing and would like to support and work with you. So clearly, let's try to make that happen. And for those out there, the email and a few web links have been provided in the chat. So please reach out. Without us all collaborating together, we're not going to make the change that we need to see. So please don't be shy and reach out. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thanks, Sandra.
Thanks so much, Robert, and to everyone who joined us. We appreciate your insightful questions. We'll share the recording of this webinar on GBBC's YouTube channel and links to learn more. Thanks again for your time, Robert, and thank you, Sandra. Till next time.